as well. Edgar, thank you so much. Let's go back to the seismologist, Dr. Lucy Jones, for an update.
Those two strands. And so we think the main fault was rupturing down towards the southwest, which would have focused the energy towards Ridgecrest. But then there's also a second fault that seems to have been activated going up to the northwest. Again, this area, that's not completely surprising. Look at those little black lines in there. There's a bunch of them. This is an area with a lot of little faults that in a rather complex area moving apart. It does suggest that Ridgecrest was particularly hard hit. We have reports from California Office of Emergency Services that there seem to be a couple of structure fires going on in Ridgecrest, and they're responding to them. There is also a small community called Trona, which is even closer to the ruptures, and it's on a dried lake bed. We do not have any communication with them yet. They would be a place that potentially there's significant damage. And so I said we're seeing at least two faults involved. This area is characterized by robust sequences. So we expect to be seeing a lot of earthquakes today, and some of them could be damaging. Probably at least one more will be damaging.
Kern County just tweeted something that suggested that they were anticipating a quake in 15 minutes. This tweet came out a little while ago.
There is nothing that gives us the time of a particular event. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think there will be a magnitude 5 today. I did that on the day of Northridge, and when it happened, people said, "You predicted the earthquake." And I said, "I predict rain in Kauai, too." This is the same situation. When the probabilities are this high, then you can say, yes, there'll probably be a magnitude 5 today, but it's not the time of any particular event. There's nothing. If somebody's giving out a time of a particular event, they're not basing it on science. Okay? That's probably what we've really got about the aftershocks. We said we don't yet have, the geologists haven't yet gotten out, so we don't have a report yet on that.
Actually, you did mention we've seen this kind of conjugate behavior.
Oh, that's true. Well, and besides, did you just notice 2 aftershocks showed up? I just saw the 2 extra red dots that showed up here. This type of, yes, conjugate behavior is relatively common. Back in 1987, we had 2 magnitude 6s on conjugate faults. The Landers earthquake with Big Bear. Big Bear was a little more separated from it, but was the same type of conjugate feature. The way the stress works, if I'm pushing in this way, I can move out here, or I can move out here. And so those essentially perpendicular, we call it conjugate faulting, is a common feature. And we'll just have to see. We're only 2 hours into this sequence. We'll have to see how it develops.
What about the Sig Alert app? Have you gotten any closer to understanding?
Yeah, so I can give an update about that. And there's maybe a little bit of misunderstanding or miscommunication. The system actually worked as designed. So an alert was sent out by the U.S. Geological Survey. The app with the City of LA is set up with various thresholds. The first threshold is a magnitude 5 earthquake or greater in LA County. It will send out an alert. This earthquake was outside of LA County, so it didn't satisfy that condition. The other condition is intensity greater than 4. The intensities in LA were 3 and lower. So the app performed as designed. It's just that the intensity levels were below that threshold that it had been set by the app. So the system actually worked as designed. It's something that we need to look into, though, as to whether maybe that threshold should be lowered or adjusted for future. And just to reiterate, though, there was the level of shaking within the city of LA area was not damaging. So in that sense, the app was worked as designed.
If it had worked as, with the levels set correctly, or
well, they were set
lower.
Yes.
What would we have seen on the app?
So if, for example, if it had been 3 intensity 3, or then people would have got notification to expect shaking. I don't know the exact wording on the app, but there would have been a significant
45 seconds.
number, 45 seconds before the shaking actually arrived. So the alert would have worked beautifully in that sense. But again, the shaking levels would not have been damaging. Certainly, it would have been great, to kind of know ahead of time.
Does it have a sound, or is it just like a text? What is it?
I'm actually
Because
not sure.
The threshold is set high enough, it's never gone off on my computer,
Yeah.
on my phone, so I'm not completely sure. I think they may be using something, well, they were going to be using a chiming alert that's used in Japan, but there was
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one they ended up using.
Yeah.
And
So.
I'm guessing the issue to not lower the levels is simply because you don't want to start getting so many alerts that people don't pay attention when they get them.
Right, and this is something that's actually been studied.
Explain that, so
Yeah.
for people who didn't hear that question.
Okay, so just to repeat, the question was, the reason why potentially that the alert level isn't set lower is so that you don't have a large number of alerts with minimal shaking. And that is correct, and this is a subjective judgment. And so in designing the app, you have to make a decision on that. There's actually been a fair amount of research looking into this in other places like Japan and Mexico, and there's some sense that people don't mind getting an alert even if the shaking is not that severe, and which would have been the case here if it had been set to intensity 3.
Sorry.
So this is something that maybe we need to, again, maybe needs to be looked at, tweaked on the system. Yes.
No, sorry. Just to clarify, because there had been some talk about 2 earthquakes today, so if you could just run through
Okay.
that.
There have been hundreds of earthquakes today. For a while, the website showed 2 magnitude 6.4s. So the way the system works is there's a lot of us recording earthquakes around the world, especially, and we have a system that if somebody else puts up an alert, and there's always the chance that the Great Pasadena earthquake means that we aren't giving out anything, so you want to have somebody else be able to say it if we're not here. And so there's a system to try and negotiate that. There was a warning, we think it was from the Tsunami Warning Center actually, and the timing, usually the system can recognize they're the same earthquake. If one of the systems gets the time a little off, then they look like different earthquakes, and the automatic system allows it to go in. So for a short time, there were 2 alerts, one from us, one from the Tsunami Warning Center, and when we recognized that it was there, we went in and cleaned it up.
Yeah.
That was not getting rid of an earthquake. By the way, I've heard the conspiracy theorists about that. It's just that we cleaned it up.
Right, and just to clarify, additionally, we had been just talking about 2 faults and so forth. That's still the case. That's not this two
Right.
earthquake issue.
Does the second fault have a name? We got Little Lake.
We're not until we get a geologist on the ground.
Yeah.
Occasionally there are reports about faults that we did not know about.
We know a lot of faults in this area. I mean, just if you look again at the picture, somehow which just disappeared on us. If we could maybe just reload the page, I would guess. But look up in that area. There's lots of little marks on it's one of the areas with a dense distribution of mapped faults. So before I'm going to talk about an unknown fault, I need a geologist to say how does this line up with the ones we know about.
Is it relevant that there are
Not to us. I think it's a psychological issue. If it's an unknown fault, my God, then we didn't know, and makes it scarier. The reality is we have a lot of little faults that never get names because they're too small until you get an earthquake.
Yeah, we've lost our earthquakes.
Was this one particularly strong for that area?
This earthquake is the largest in the Little Lake area in the last century. But in general, the Owens Valley, the sort of geologic structures up there, have had a lot of earthquakes like this. There was actually a 7.5 in 1872 that ran through, it was usually called the Independence earthquake, or sometimes just the Owens Valley earthquake. Mammoth historically has had dozens of magnitude 6s. So as a geologist, I'll say that area, largest earthquake in 100 years. Does that make it unusual? No. From geology, we really need to know, we need to look at millennia to say what's standard.
Once geologists are there, how long does it take for them to gather information?
Well, no, we're waiting for the picture to show up. I mean, they'll take a picture
Yeah.
and send it to us and go, look, there's the fault offset.
Yeah.
There's one level at which it's simple. The geologists, presuming there are fault offsets, will probably be mapping it in detail over the next month.
Are they in trucks or helicopters or?
Hey, we don't have enough money to send helicopters. They're in trucks.
The National Guard does. I really don't know how you guys do that.
Yeah, no, not the geologists. Look at our budget sometime.
Yeah. Yeah. So
They're en route.
they are en route, and as soon as we have information, regarding fault offsets or anything like that, we'll provide it. Hopefully within the next briefing or so.
And since we don't have any pictures of yet, can you again sort of illustrate what that's going to look like? What a seismologist would want to take a photo of?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So we're speculating a little bit here in that we don't
You think?
we don't know yet if this fault actually ruptured to the ground surface, and it's magnitude 6.4s in California sometimes break all the way to the ground surface and sometimes don't. So until we actually have some definitive information, if it did break up to the ground surface, what we should see is where two sides of the rock or two sides of the ground that were close together have slid horizontally relative to each other. And there may be some vertical displacements as well, but given the information that we have recorded, the seismographs, it looks like the offset on the fault, if it has broken to the surface, will be that horizontal strike slip motion.
How does that information help you? Is it
Well, obviously, if in terms of damage, if you have a pipeline or a structure that straddles that fault and it moves sideways, that could be very devastating. I don't know if that's the case here again. Also, in terms of the ground shaking that was experienced in the Ridgecrest area. Lucy was talking before about how the earthquake started off to the northeast and propagated to the southwest towards Ridgecrest. With this type of horizontal motion, that can actually be amplified. Again, until we actually get some definitive information from some folks there, I can't be sure about that, but it is a possibility.
Also, we now do a better job of correlating what we get from our instruments with what is recorded in the ground. It used to be we needed the geologist in the field to tell us what happened on the fault. And in fact, the details, we get more details by walking down that fault than we'll ever get from an instrument. We over many years of recording them and comparing them, we have a guess that that magnitude 6.4 is partially a statement of how much slip happened, how much one side moved with respect to the other. And at that magnitude, with this fault length, it's on the order, it's under a meter, but a half a meter to, so a couple feet. So it's potentially a pretty big offset. The question is whether it's confined at depth or whether it made it up to the surface. And there have been hypotheses that if it comes to the surface, you get a different shaking pattern than if it doesn't. And not everyone agrees with that hypothesis, and so that's an interesting piece of scientific testing that can go on because of it.
what's your knowledge of this fault in terms of how deep it is?
Faults, most faults, well, we don't, right? If it is, because we don't even know what fault it is yet, right? If it is the Little Lake fault, that fault is mapped at the surface. That means that some previous earthquake it has come through to the surface. Most earthquakes begin about 5 to 10 miles below the surface. It's difficult to get a big earthquake to start up close to the surface. There's not enough confining pressure. By the way, if a fault could open up, you can't have an earthquake, right? Because the earthquake is shaking, just like snapping your fingers. Try snapping your fingers when they've opened up. You don't make a sound, right? And that's, if the fault opens up, you wouldn't be producing any shaking. And at the surface, it's not as confined. So the earthquakes happen deeper down. So most faults in California extend at least from if we map it at the surface, it probably goes at least 10 miles down, and probably more than that. And it's just as it gets deeper down, it behaves differently.
There's a lot of ancient volcanic history out of Little Lake, correct? The Little Lake is a volcanic region. There are some active volcanics. Right.
There's
a cinder cone.
Yeah, well, and the China Lake Weapons Center runs a geothermal plant there, so there's magma at depth, there's molten rock at depth, which has been used to tap for geothermal energy. So it's a potentially volcanic area.
What did you say was your prediction of the likelihood of a quake above 6.4?
9%.
9%.
And over the next week. And if we get through a day, then it'll be a lot lower. It's not an even thing over the week. The most likely time is right now. And as we see, actually, well, we aren't at the moment.
On the right?
Okay.
I got it up on the right.
Okay.
I don't know why.
The rate of aftershocks is substantially lower now than it was in the first briefing, right? So these things do die off really quickly with time. Any other questions? Wrap it up.
Thank you. Back at 1:30 or 2?
Let's at 2 o'clock at this
Yeah.
point. We'll come back and see if we have some more information.
Just super quickly, sorry. You mentioned the China Lake Naval Weapons Station, and you've been saying damage is probably highest in the Ridgecrest and China Lake area. Are you hearing of any damage at that Naval Weapons Station?
Remember, damage does not get reported to us.
Right.
We had a phone call with OES, who the only thing they told us was about structure fires in Ridgecrest.
Okay, and I heard about a water main break in San Bernardino. Any idea if that's related?
That's pathetic. It could be. It improbable, but it must have, if it did, it was already in bad shape.
Yeah, well, San Bernardino, it's old. No. Yeah.
All right, so listening to those seismologists, Tom Sater, my takeaway is that there is still a chance of another big quake, but the issue is it's impossible to predict the timing.
Yes, and she mentioned that she wouldn't be surprised if we had a 5.4, 5.5 that could do some more damage. And if you go back and look at all the earthquakes in history and all the data we've received, that's pretty much right on, and I'll show you. What I thought was interesting though, Brooke, a reporter asked about, well, we thought maybe there were 2 large quakes, and that goes back to about a half hour ago when we were talking about discrepancy on, instead of 1033, 1035, instead of 5 miles deep, 2.5. So we've got that cleared up, that it's only 1. But when she talked about it not being the San Andreas faults, as reported earlier, and it's well east where there's all these smaller faults, the picture she showed looked exactly like what you would see in central Italy. Some of the, of course, earthquakes we've covered there, they have a whole network of smaller quakes.
Look at that roadway.
There you go. You know what, we should mention this though too, because if we see, and if you look at this, when you have a 6.4 magnitude quake, typically you'll have at least 1 aftershock that is 5.4 or greater. That's what she was talking about. Sure, there could be 100 plus that are 3.4 or higher. So to anyone, if they have power in Ridgecrest or the surrounding area, if you've got power and maybe inspecting your home, you see a pretty large crack in the plaster or the sheetrock or across your ceiling, you may not want to stay for the evening if it's significant. Now, it doesn't mean that anything's going to happen even with a 5.4, but really, can't not stress this enough, Brooke, that there could be more damage if we get this aftershock in the next 24 hours.
Tom, hang with me. I want to have a quick conversation with